Hey there, folks. Remember a few months ago when I spent like 20 minutes praising the era of the Game Boy Advance? Yeah, well, you already saw the title of this video, and that it's part 1 of 2, so you probably already know what you came for. Your click sustained my obsession, okay? Plus, the Game Boy Advance is the best thing ever made, and I'm gonna talk about it as much as I want. Deal with it. But seriously, I just figured since news of Virtual Console on the Switch hasn't been great so far, it might be fun to reminisce some more about some games that are readily available to play through other means. Oh, that was a pirate wink. I realized that was probably confusing. But yeah, I might as well give these unknown gems some pirate love, since Nintendo isn't getting around to letting us buy them anytime soon. Oh, I'm sorry, Reggie. Please don't terminate me. Whew. Okay, yeah, let's just get to the games before this becomes a 3-part video. Okay, I know what you're thinking. You click on that clickbait title like, Best Games No One Played, and then the first game I bring up is the number 4 best-selling game on the system. But hear me out. In my own personal experience, this is consistently the one Mario Kart game that people had heard of but never played, aside from maybe Mario Kart 8 before the Switch version released. And that makes sense, because it's also the worst-selling Mario Kart game of all time. That's right, I don't think you guys realize how much the GBA was literally a Pokémon machine, when the 4th-selling game on the system is also the lowest-selling game in its series. So yeah, while this is probably the most well-known game on this list, it was definitely worth a mention because it's a tragedy that so many people passed this one over. I think a big part of the problem is that it came out after the excellent Mario Kart 64, with its beautiful shift to full 3D mechanics and its stellar multiplayer mode that introduced the world to Block Vault. To follow that up with a game that looks much more akin to the original game on SNES, even though it was 4 years after the N64 version, understandably people didn't want to check out a game that looked like a step back. But describing this game as such does it a disservice. The playable racers all have very specific stat differences for the first time in the series, which for many people is the first time they even knew there were differences in the racers. And it also has some absolutely fantastic track design and diversity, made even more impressive considering the simplistic Mode 7 graphics it utilizes. Say what you will about the GBA's attempts at 3D, but man, I have such a soft spot for Mode 7. It was just a different time in gaming, and there was such a flawed authenticity to it. But I digress. Point is, the game is excellently polished, well-crafted, and surprisingly hard due to tight turns and a heavier focus on coin pickups for speed. This game also holds a special place in my heart as one of the few games I was determined to 100% complete as a kid, which essentially means getting a perfect S ranking in every cup at every speed, a feat that is so not worth it. But I spent a lot of time on buses for choir trips, and 100% bragging rights in a Mario Kart game that none of my friends were even playing was way more important than socializing, obviously. This could possibly be another controversial pick, as it's still in the top-selling GBA list, though it's much further down at number 14. The reason this one, again, is worth including on this list despite its modestly good sales is that it's absolutely fantastic. It oozes a level of polish that I wouldn't have expected from a game that came out within the first 6 months of the system's release. It has wonderfully stylized graphics, smooth animations, impressive level diversity, and some very unique gameplay mechanics that were either modified from past entries in the series, such as the transformation mechanics, or entirely new to the game, such as the increased roster of special moves. There was also a really clever system that I don't think is in any other game, where your goal for the level is to just traverse it and find 4 parts of a door lock, and a bird key that opens the next level, but before you find them all, you might reach the technical end of the level, where you hit a switch shaped like a frog, for some reason, which activates a time bomb and changes up some aspects of the level, sending you on a race to grab the last few things you need in the level and get back to the entrance before the time runs out. Sometimes this is a pretty simple race to the finish, but other times it adds noticeable tension to finishing up the puzzles and grabbing important stage elements in the last seconds before jumping in the portal. Combine this with the aforementioned ridiculous transformations and the even more ridiculous level bosses, and this is a game that many people might have tried out, but few put a lot of time into. Though, I'll admit, I'm not factoring in the amount of people that probably picked it up since it was on the 3DS and Wii U Virtual Consoles, because that's not the spirit of this list. Let me gush about the things I want to gush about, dang it. We're arguably getting into the more obscure territory now, so it's harder to decide the order, but I put this one so high because it's just not as good as some of the others on this list. I still love it, don't get me wrong, and its unique gameplay makes it worth checking out if you've never heard of it, or its sequel on the DS. It features the same lovable cast of characters from the mainline Donkey Kong games, but instead of being a side-scrolling collectathon, it's a mostly vertical crawler where DK grabs a series of pegs using L and R buttons to control each hand, or hold them both to charge in the direction he's pointed to break barrels or attack enemies. These simple controls allow a lot of the normal gameplay mechanics of Donkey Kong, from bouncing on magically floating tires, to collecting banana bunches, etc. It's a very simple game concept, and when it works, it's a lot of fun. But because of how simplified the controls are, they can tend to be a little finicky, especially when it comes to timing attacks and grabbing pegs, which can lead to a lot of vertical ground lost, and therefore a lot of rage gained. But I'd be remiss to not include such a unique type of game on this list, as I think the changes made to the traditional Donkey Kong formula turned most people away, and that's a shame. But hey, it still did well enough to garner a sequel, so what do I know? I just reminisce and talk to the internet. You all know Final Fantasy Tactics and its GBA counterpart Tactics Advance, right? Amazing strategy RPGs with a lot of combat depth and long, talky story segments in between the grid-based battles. Yeah, this isn't either of those, but it's close. The Tactics Ogre series is actually older than either of those, going all the way back to the SNES era, but this GBA entry is admittedly the only one I ever played. This is another example of a game that came out extremely early in the GBA lifecycle, so while it has some strange design quirks, mostly in how you organize and upgrade the party members, it's still a very solid entry into the strategy RPG genre, and since it came out in a pre-Tactics Advance world, it was one of my favorite games in those early days of the GBA. It doesn't hold a candle to the more popular series, but that game also clearly took a lot of cues from this game, so we'll call it a wash. It has some mechanics that set it apart though, and that's a lot of what I like about it. For example, there are different classes in the game, but they're not as much of a focus as the job system in the Final Fantasy Tactics games, and the smaller variety of classes means each one has a more diverse range of abilities, and it matters more what weapons and equipment you outfit your soldiers with. The same class could have a sword, axe, and or a bow, for example, if you skimmed on their armor selection. Also, position on the field is much more important because unless you attack from behind, there's always a chance the attacker will get hit by a counterattack. So carefully placing your party with their backs to buildings could turn the tide of battle, even during the enemy phase. And for those that like that kind of thing, the game does feature permadeath. And since so much of your party is recruited from shops, and they're not cheap, it adds a lot of difficulty to the game. Also, every troop is tied to one of 4 elements, so it's important to factor that in when building your party, because if you have a whole team weak to ice, you might end up having a bad time in certain terrain around certain monsters. Overall, this game just feels more tactical than any of the Final Fantasy Tactics games, and while the story can get a little wordy sometimes, so can I. So, I can't fault it for having things to say. It's also just another example of beautiful sprite art on the system, especially given how early it came in the GBA lifecycle. I'm going to say that a lot, by the way, because that little handheld pushed so much more power than it had any right to. I'd argue a lot of people didn't even know there was a game in the Mana series on the GBA, which, to be fair, most people don't know the series continued after the only one on the SNES. In the US, at least. But to that I say, educate yourself, nerd fakers. This entry is kind of a spiritual remake of the first game in the series, which was actually called Final Fantasy Adventures on the original Game Boy. Actually, I'm not surprised more people aren't educated on this series. It's had a super confusing history in this country. Anyway, this game plays very similar to Secret of Mana on the SNES, which is actually the second game in the series, if you're keeping track. You control each party member individually, toggling between them as you wish, and run around the map attacking enemies in an action RPG hack-and-slash system. It's fairly simple, but the series has a lot of charm and a beautiful art style, and while this is admittedly nowhere near as good as Legend of Mana, which released around the same time on the PS1, it is the only one available on the go, so that more than makes up for it. It also takes a cue from other entries in the series by having 2 playable protagonists, and each has slightly altered gameplay sections. In this game, there's a mystery connecting the two, which I won't spoil here because it's a 15-year-old game and you're currently on the internet. Look it up if you want to know without playing it. Anyway, the game opens differently depending on which character you choose, and continues to diverge until the two meet and join each other's party, allowing you to then play as both and find out what connects them. This gives the game a lot of replayability because you really do need to play as both of them to get the full story. That being said, Legend of Mana is available on the PSN and is a better game, so if you don't mind dropping a few bucks and have a PS3, pick that up also. The Mana series is just great in general. Play them all.
Mario Pinball Land!
This is another game I feel like some people might have heard of, but probably never checked out, because, let's be honest, pinball games are for a pretty niche audience, and Mario isn't going to do much to fix that. But, as someone who has never been able to get into pinball in any form, I gotta admit this game hooked me. Don't get me wrong, it's very hard, and the gameplay mechanics are divisive at best, but by blending classic pinball mechanics with combat, collection, and exploration gameplay, it adds some depth to what is otherwise just a score-building game. All your Mario stuff is here, collecting coins and stars, using power-ups, squishing Goombas, and beating up big boss creatures. The only difference is you have to aim and time flipper hits to fling your Mario ball into action for you. This can be pretty tricky when you're just struggling to get through a star door you just opened to get to the next screen, especially if you miss and hit the hole instead and then have to redo the progress in the room once you get back in. But there's just something endearing and original about the way this game works and makes pinball fun the way other attempts like Pokémon Pinball or Metroid Pinball couldn't. It's a shame there's not more control over Mario though, such as possibly a limited bounce mechanic or a table shake to give that little boost needed to hit what you need to hit. But in a series that's become notoriously easy, there's something refreshing about how unforgiving this game is. Plus, in ROM form, you can always just save state scum the crap out of it. Okay, I know the title is like, illegible, which isn't a good start, but this game is called Payback. It might be one of the most unknown games on this list, and for good reason since it never actually came to the US. All we got was the average at best, watered-down version of GTA on the system, with its strange, disorienting graphic style and clunky controls that made vehicles extremely hard to steer, and weapons almost as difficult to control. Payback, on the other hand, has a similar playstyle as a top-down murder-a-thon game, but plays more like an arcade-style challenge-based game on smaller maps. Without a major story focus, I could see it appearing less interesting than the GTA games it clones, but that would be a naive opinion, and you should feel bad for thinking that. For one, this game looks gorgeous by GBA standards, garbage title screen aside, and the way it manages to simulate this 3D world is so impressive, especially when compared to Rockstar's own ugly GBA offering. Also, while the controls are still a little unconventional, they manage to work way better and vehicles controlled much tighter, making the game overall just more fun to play. It's essentially tank controls, which means you press A to move forward, and then the directions just pivot your angle. This alone infinitely improves weapon aiming, as well as giving cars a more natural steering feel. Basically, this game does everything that the GTA game probably way more people played should have done. Yeah, I'm throwing shades at the big dogs. What are you gonna do? Come back in the next video for the rest of this list. I suddenly have a really bad headache to take care of right now. Do all the, like, subscribe, share stuff that... I'm feeling really lightheaded. I think I'm just gonna lay down. Until next time, have fun. American Skateland was the DS version of American Wasteland on console, which was just okay in the oversaturated landscape of yearly Tony Hawk releases by the time it came out, but Skateland was notable for being the first Tony Hawk game on the new dual-screen system, and arguably a better game than its console counterpart. It also had a pretty sweet pun in the title. It introduced unique concepts such as creating your own graffiti, skateboard, and other customizations, and uploading them to others via the fledgling Nintendo Wi-Fi connection.